Hi, everyone. So, we've been thinking a lot recently about ecosystem structures and the way that energy will flow through a food web within an ecosystem. And in this video, we're going to be talking about species interactions, which refer to relationships between pairs of species. So, we're going to be thinking about two species that interact with one another, and we're going to be classifying that relationship based on the effect that it has on both of the involved parties. So we can think of three different effects that a relationship could have on a species. That effect could be positive, negative, or it could be neutral. And when we think about both of the species that are interacting with one another, we're going to classify or give a name to their relationship based on, for both parties, what kind of effect we're seeing. And so, sort of the worst case scenario would be that it has a negative effect on both parties, and that would be called competition. So, an example here is that a hyena and a lion eat a lot of the same kinds of food, they have the same prey, they live in the same kinds of areas, so they're competing for resources, and that has a negative effect on both. We could also have a positive effect on one species, but a negative effect on the other. And that kind of relationship is called consumption. So the example here is this cute little bunny eating a plant. Good for the rabbit because it gets food, bad for the plant because it's getting eaten. The sort of best case scenario would be called mutualism, and that's when we have a positive effect on both species. And the example we have here is pollination. So the flower gets its pollen spread, and the pollinator, in this case the hummingbird, gets a meal. And then finally, we have commensalism, and this is where we have a positive effect for one species and no effect on the other. So it's not harmed, but it's not getting any benefit either. And the example we have here is a shrimp and a sea cucumber. So the sea cucumber gets the shrimp is using the sea cucumber for transportation. It's getting to sort of ride around on it, but it's not harming or helping the sea cucumber in any way. So the rest of this video, we're going to be going into a little bit more detail about these different kinds of species interactions. But before we do that, I just wanted to clear up one point of vocabulary. And that has to do with this idea of symbiosis. So symbiosis, I think a lot of people think of the word as meaning what we just described as mutualism, where two species both benefit from an interaction. But the actual definition of symbiosis is a lot more broad than that. So symbiosis refers to any interaction between two organisms that's close and long-term. So generally, one species is going to be living on or in the other species for an extended period of time. And so we can look at these two examples. This kingfisher with a minnow is going to be a predator-prey relationship. And so as soon as the bird eats the fish, they're not together anymore. So that would not count as symbiosis. But if you look at this fungus on a tree, the fungus is living on the tree. It's going to be there for quite a long time. So that would be categorized as a symbiotic relationship. So it doesn't have to be an interaction where two parties are both benefiting. That's one option that can happen if it's a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. But we could also think of parasitic relationships where the parasite is living in the host. It's harming the host, but they're still close and long term. So that would still count as well. And we can also have commensalism within a symbiotic relationship. So one organism benefiting and the other having a neutral effect. Okay, so that's just to keep in mind that as we're talking about these different categories, we also have this added layer of thinking about whether that relationship is symbiotic or not. So let's start with this first one, which is the saddest one, competition, where both species are negatively affected. And we can more precisely define competition as the use or defense of a resource by one individual that reduces the availability of that resource to other individuals. And this is going to occur when two species have at least some overlap in the types of resources that they're trying to use. We can see a picture here of a gopher or something and some birds fighting over some sort of nut or seed. So food would be one example of a resource that organisms might fight over. We could also think of things like habitats. Maybe two species want to be living in the same area. In nature, as it happens, I think a lot of times we might be imagining two members of the same species fighting over a resource like mates, so that you think of like fighting over something like that. But when competition occurs between two different species, often we don't see that kind of antagonistic relationship. More often, what we see is that the two species will sort of just try to stay out of each other's way, and natural selection is going to favor traits that minimize competition between the two. There's less food for both because they both use it, and it would only be worse for both of them if, in addition to that, they were also fighting over it. So instead, we see what's called resource partitioning, where basically species will find a way to sort of draw that line across the room, but in nature. So we have examples here down below of these warblers that are all in a spruce tree, and they're trying to eat the same kinds of food. And to sort of stay out of their way, we have different species of these warblers that live in different parts of the tree. So one species is going to feed just at the top of the tree, one species is going to stay in the middle, and the other is going to be down at the bottom. So we could subdivide the resource in that way. We can also think of different ways that we just won't run into each other, or that the species, not us, won't run into one another. So hawks and owls a lot of times will eat the same kinds of prey, but the hawks will feed during the day and the owls will feed at night. So you can do a sort of temporal division of a resource as well. Okay, so that's one example where both parties want the same resource. There's less resource for both parties in that case, so everyone's harmed. The other, or the next type of relationship that we'll talk about, is called consumption. So this is the one where we have a positive effect on one organism, the thing doing the eating, and a negative effect on the other organism, the thing being eaten. And so we've already talked a little bit in our food webs and food chains about this idea of a predator-prey relationship, or a predation relationship. And here we're going to have a predator that is going to be the organism that's killing and consuming something else. And the prey is going to be the negatively affected organism, the thing that's being eaten. So that's one, I think, the most straightforward example. We could also think of consumption as being referring to herbivores. So in this sense, the sort of predator is the herbivore, the thing that's eating the plants. And you could think of the plants as being sort of like the prey, the thing being eaten. But we just give it a special name when it's plants that are being eaten instead of animals. And then finally, we also have parasitism. We referred to this briefly already when we were talking about symbiosis, because by definition, if an organism is feeding on an organism, it's usually going to be living in or on its host. And so that would be a symbiotic relationship. But parasites are another example of consumption. They're not eating the whole thing. They're not eating like a whole host, but they're eating sort of part of the host, or they're taking resources from the host. So it's harming the host. So still a positive effect for the parasite and a negative effect for the host. So let's spend a little bit of time on each of these three different examples of consumption. So first predators, then we'll look at herbivores, and then finally we'll think about parasites. So prey have all kinds of different responses that help them defend themselves or escape from predators. And so this is looking at a few examples of those kinds of responses. We have escape behavior, so running away, or you could think of, this is showing deer that are fleeing. Squid have, jet propulsion that can help them get away from predators. So just escaping is one way. We also have active defense. So things like armor or weapons. This porcupine or this hedgehog has these spiky little quills that will make it more difficult to eat because it's got those spikes. We could also have camouflage or cryptic coloration. So this just makes the prey harder to see. And if it's harder to see, then it's harder to eat. This is showing an owl, which is not a good example because an owl is not prey, but the same idea applies. You guys know what I mean. We also have mimicry. So a lot of species will evolve to look more like a poisonous species. So ants are unpalatable to a lot of different predators, and we see an ant at the top, but the bottom organism is actually a spider, and it looks very much like the ant. And the idea is that it won't get eaten as much because predators will think that it's this thing that doesn't taste good to them. Sort of related to that, we have defensive chemicals. So a lot of prey have poison, or they can either just taste bad or they can be poisonous, and that will make predators less likely to eat them. And to go along with that, they often have these loud warning colors so that predators know not to eat them. So these monarch butterflies are an example. They're bright orange, and that's to let predators know, like, hey, I'm poisonous. Um, and then finally, we also have school or herd or flock formation. So basically moving around as a group. And statistically, you're just less likely to be eaten if you're one of 100 or one of 1,000 instead of just wandering around all by yourself. It also, there's more organisms to sort of act as more organisms to scout for predators in the area. So plants have it a little harder because they can't run away, they can't move, they can't voluntarily get into a herd, right? They're kind of stuck in one place, but they do still have defenses that they use to defend themselves from herbivores. And these generally fall into one of two categories. So mechanical defenses are more like the kinds of things we can see. So if you think about the thorns on a spiky plant like a blackberry or a rose, that obviously is going to deter some predators from eating that. We also have sticky resins or sap that can physically trap different kinds of bugs or insects that might be trying to eat the plant. Some sort of seeds have tough outer shells, that kind of thing. So mechanical defenses is one way. They also have chemical defenses. So these are things that are harder to see, but if a plant makes a toxic or noxious compound, then some predators, herbivores, will be less likely to eat them. So an example is capsaicin in a pepper plant. If a predator is unable to deal with that chemical, then they'll not eat the pepper. So this is actually where a lot of our drugs and spices and pesticides come from, because these plants are making chemicals that are meant to be interacting with other living organisms. And then finally, parasites, which I think are the coolest one. So parasites are often highly, highly specialized to their host. And with a parasite's life cycle, a lot of times they'll need to go from one organism or one place in an ecosystem to another as part of their life cycle. So I think some of the cool things, I mean, there's obviously things like hookworms and tapeworms and other ticks, those kinds of things. I think we all know about those kinds of parasites, but parasites, in addition to having sort of their own physical specializations, like, pincers for grabbing onto a scalp or something like that, or a mosquito with its long uh, proboscis. I'm not actually sure, but a parasite often can actually affect the behavior of its host as well, to increase its chance of reaching the next stage in its life cycle. So I have two examples here. One is this fungus that can infect an ant. And when this ant is infected by the fungus, it will leave its colony. It will leave the area of the forest that it usually is hanging out in, and it'll just go attach itself to a leaf, and it'll bite onto the underside of a leaf. And then over the course of a few days, this fungus is going to sprout from its head and sprout, and then the spores will fall to the ground. So this fungus actually induces the ant to do this very bizarre behavior of going and clinging onto the underside of a leaf and just waiting for the fungus to sprout from its head, and then the ant dies. And another example is toxoplasmosis. So toxoplasmosis, its long-term host is within cats. But if rats can be sort of a temporary host. But if a rat gets infected by this parasite, it'll actually make the rat less afraid of cats and make them more likely to go do sort of risky behavior and seek out cats. And this increases the chance that the toxoplasmosis will find its long-term host within the cat. Okay, so let's move on to mutualism. So this is the sort of best case scenario where both parties are benefiting. So a plus-plus relationship. And I've got three examples here. We'll just go over them really quickly. Leaf cutter ants will go and cut off bits of plants, and then they'll actually sort of harvest. They'll use them to make a little garden for fungus. So they'll mash up the leaves. They'll put them in a special little chamber with the right humidity. They'll plant fungus spores in there, and then they'll tend to the fungus as it grows. So they'll make sure that no bad things are getting in there. They'll add more leaf mash, and then as the fungus grows, the ants will eat it. So the ants get a food source, but then they also will go and poop out the fungus spores in other parts of the in other parts of the area. So the fungus is, being tended to and also gets its spores spread by the ants. Pollination, I already briefly described in the introduction, but the pollinator is going to get food and the plant is going to get its pollen spread. And then here's an example with a crocodile and a bird, and the crocodile gets its mouth cleaned because the bird is eating, bacteria and dirt and other stuff in the crocodile's mouth, and the bird gets food. Okay, so commensalism is our relationship where one organism benefits and the other organism is not harmed or helped. So neutral for one species and helpful for the other. And our classic example is barnacles on a whale. Barnacles are filter feeders. So within they feed by like having fresh water with nutrients pass through them. So by being attached to a whale, they get lots of water flow and nutrients in that way, but it doesn't hurt the whale. So having these barnacles attached to the skin doesn't affect the whale in any way. So that's one example. And another example are these egrets with cattle, and they eat the bugs that are stirred up by the cattle moving around. So they get more food by hanging out with the cattle, but it doesn't hurt the cattle to have these birds hanging around. Maybe they're annoyed, I don't know, but it doesn't harm them. So that's another example of commensalism. Okay, so those were all of our relationships, but I wanted to end the video by talking really briefly about what happens when species are interacting like this over long periods of time, like over evolutionary time. So you can imagine that if two species are having these close relationships or interacting with each other so frequently, they might impact each other's evolution. So this, in fact, does happen, and the word for this is coevolution. So this is a pattern of evolution in which two species are reciprocally influencing each other's adaptations. So you could think of this as being something as simple as a predator and prey relationship, where the predator gets some sort of adaptation that helps it better identify and spot prey. And then the prey might evolve in response. Maybe it's going to develop better camouflage, or maybe it's going to develop some mutation, or it's going to get some mutation that makes it able to escape more quickly or something like that. And then the predator might evolve in turn again. So it could be something like that. We have another example here on this slide of a plant called Darwin's orchid and this long-tongued sphinx moth. So Darwin actually saw this plant with the nectar for this plant is way down here at the bottom. So even though people hadn't found this sphinx moth yet, the prediction was like if there's a plant that has the nectar way down at the bottom, there must be a pollinator that's got a really, really long proboscis. And then eventually they later did find it. But so you can see the pressure for the sphinx moth to get access to this resource. The evolutionary pressure is for it to be developing a longer tongue. And also for the plant itself, the pollination is actually going to occur up here with the sort of base of the proboscis. And pollination occurs more effectively if the moth has to sort of like really get into the flower so that the base of its proboscis is sort of pressed up against where the pollen is in the plant. So for the plant, the pressure is for it to have a longer pollen tube, or sorry, a longer nectar tube, and that way the moth is forced to sort of like really, really reach in there for the nectar, and then the pollination will occur more successfully. So as the pressure is on the orchid to have a longer nectar tube, the moth develops a longer proboscis, and then it's sort of a back and forth for both of them, where there's selection for longer tongues and longer pollen tubes. So this idea, evolution, where we're getting reciprocal influence on two species from one another, that's called coevolution. Okay, so that's our video. I know it was a little bit of a long one, so I apologize for that, and I will see you all later.